From the Fox Studios in New York City, this is Maria Bartiromo's Wall Street.
And happy weekend to all. Welcome to the program that analyzes the week that was and helps position you for the week ahead. I'm Maria Bartiromo. It's an economic showdown between Biden and Trump. The former president making his case for MAGAnomics this week to congressional Republicans and some of the most powerful CEOs.
We have inflation that's killing everybody. And we're going to end that. We're going to bring back our jobs. We're going to bring back common sense to government. There's tremendous unity in the Republican Party. We have one thing in mind, and that's making our country great.
Among his many tax plans, he's apparently floating the idea of replacing some income taxes with tariffs as the government's primary revenue source. A stark contrast from President Biden's economic vision of raising taxes. The last budget had $5.5 trillion in new taxes. Biden continuing to double down on the economy, touting the latest inflation report, trying to sell corporate America on Bidenomics. But voters are not feeling the relief, still getting squeezed by high prices.
I'm making more money now than I've ever did in my life, and it's paycheck to paycheck.
Housing prices have soared, interest rates have soared.
How are we going to pay off our student loans? How are we eventually going to buy a house? I think the state of the country is really scary.
Voters are worried about putting food on their tables and gas in their tanks. Joining me right now is North Dakota Senator Kevin Cramer, who sat in on Trump's address to senators on Thursday. Senator, it's great to have you this weekend. Thank you so much for being here. What did you make of former President Trump, and what did you get from his agenda on the economy, energy, and what are your thoughts on that idea to replace income tax with tariffs?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And it was a wonderful meeting. It was a very upbeat meeting. Not surprisingly, he's eternally optimistic, which is contagious to all of us. And the unifying message was very strong. And you're right. The meeting with senators focused a lot on the economy. It focused a lot on inflation within the economy. In fact, he went so far as to say, when I say inflation, I'm talking about the economy, which I think demonstrates that common sense that he talks about. The economy is not just about Wall Street. As much as we love Wall Street, it's about Main Street. It's about middle class and working class Americans. And Donald Trump, the billionaire from Manhattan, has done more to bring middle class America back into the Republican fold than any president in my lifetime, at least since Ronald Reagan. So I liked the discussion with regard to replacing the income tax with tariffs, or at least primarily. We have a couple of issues with that. One is, first of all, Donald Trump has taught a lot of us free market traders, free trading Republicans, that there is a role for tariffs. I've never seen tariffs as necessarily a revenue source to fund the government as much as a trade tool to enforce the rules of the game, if you will, particularly with cheaters. And that's where he's used them so effectively, whether it's China dumping steel on our market, Mexico dumping sugar on our markets. And when you use tariffs, in my view, it's not just about the revenue source, but doing business with your adversaries versus your allies and your friends. And so you'd have to do it in a very precise way, I think. But Maria, ultimately, tariffs should change the behavior to the point where you wouldn't have so many tariffs. You'd have a booming economy because more things would be made and produced right here in the United States. That, and then the fact that the Constitution does, in fact, have income taxes as the primary source of revenue for our country. It would get complicated, but again, he's stretched me a lot further than I ever thought I'd be on this.
What did President Trump say about regulation? I know that during his term in the last presidency, this was one of his major tools to sparking economic growth, just taking regulations down and unshackling corporate America.
I would submit to you, Maria, and I think President Trump would agree, that regulations are a bigger burden on investment and on the American economy than even high taxes. And what he did with regulations, which is exactly the opposite of what Joe Biden has done with regulations, I think can unleash the American economy like nothing else. I mean, right here in North Dakota, where most of our oil is not under federal land, I think we're a pretty good illustration of what happens when you have a more balanced regulatory and tax regime than the the out of balance one that the Biden administration used. And Biden administrations used regulations and taxes to punish success rather than to incentivize success. And Donald Trump just intuitively understands this. And again, back to his geopolitics, he understands that there's nothing meritorious about transferring your climate guilt to polluting countries in any way, shape, or form. And so he talked a lot about energy policy in the context of this inflation problem, and rightfully so. I mean, energy is up way more than everything else cumulatively. I mean, electricity is up 28% from when he was president. Gasoline's up 55% from when he was president. So he understands it intuitively, and so do the American people, by the way.
Yeah, and that's not the only rules and regulations that we're talking about. You're co-sponsoring a bill introduced by Ohio Senator J.D. Vance to bring an end to Biden's woke social experiment. It aims to dismantle diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in the federal government. The legislation includes repealing Biden's DEI executive orders, getting rid of the DEI trainings, outlawing mandatory DEI pledges, and preventing federal contracts from being awarded to businesses that employ DEI practices. How realistic is this? And tell us about this.
Yeah, well, I think it's fairly realistic only because I think what you're seeing is the DEI experiment in many places is already fading. Well, the thing about DEI is that it eliminates the diversity of ideas. While it may force the diversity of how somebody looks or what they think, it doesn't with how they actually intellectually process and apply their intellect to the job. Everybody's looking to apply this weird standard that has nothing to do with profit or the economy or outcomes, rather than than sticking to their knitting, as Jay Powell likes to say.
Senator, I know North Dakota voters passed a measure this week banning anyone from the state from running or serving in the U.S. House or Senate if they are or will turn 81 years old during their term. This new age limit is seen as a test case for the country. Do you think your state was motivated to do this after seeing Joe Biden's current condition at 81?
Well, I hope it had more to do with him than it did with me, because I'm only 63 and I'm not going to be 81 by the time I leave. But yeah, I do think that. I think that's exactly what's motivating people. But I think it's a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction, quite honestly. First of all, our system is built on choice, and the great thing about self-governance is we can fire our elected officials and not give them longevity, and we should probably do more of that. But that's up to us as the voters, in my view. Then I look at a guy like Chuck Grassley from Iowa, a senator who's 90 years old, and it'd take two 45-year-olds to keep up with the guy. So I don't think it should be about the age. I think it should be about the decision of the voter. They ought to maybe, consider age as one of the factors. I don't think it stands up to constitutional scrutiny. It may be a test case, but I believe it'll be a long time before it's tested, because I'm not going to be running when I'm 75 years old. I don't know whether my colleague John Hoban is or anybody else will be. But at some point, that moment will come, and then there'll have to be a challenge to the constitutionality of that decision.
Well, let me ask you this, Senator. Would you support term limits?
I don't, because I think term limits are sort of like the age limit. It reduces choice, and our system's not built on reducing choice. Why you'd want to voluntarily reduce your choice, I don't know. But again, I've never stayed in the same position long enough to be impacted by it personally. I do understand the frustration people see. But, when you look at, I think the House of Representatives right now, there's only like 87 out of the 435 that were in the House of Representatives when the Trump tax cuts passed. So when you think about that level of turnover, our system works pretty well. The problem, Maria, is that so many of the higher profile leaders in Congress are the ones that stick around the longest, and they become a bit of the face of the Congress. But, so I understand people's frustration with it. I've never been a big fan of limiting my choices.
Senator, it's good to have you this weekend. We so appreciate your time.
Thank you, Maria. Always a pleasure.
All right. And to you, Senator Kevin Cramer. A wild ride on Wall Street that including new record highs for the S&P and the NASDAQ this week. But where do stocks go from here? Piper Sandler's Michael Kantrowitz on where he's putting his money now. That's next. Welcome back. Here's a look at where markets ended a week of several record highs for the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ. Investors digesting cooler than expected inflation data. And the Federal Reserve is now forecasting just one rate cut later this year. Joining me now is Piper Sandler's chief investment strategist, Michael Kantrowitz. Michael, always a pleasure. Great to see you. Give us your sense of markets today and how the second half may look. Here we are at the first half mark, and we are looking at outsized gains for stocks led by tech.
Yeah, we could have had this conversation exactly this time a year ago, and we would be saying the same thing. The market's up about as much as the S&P was at this time last year, and the leadership has also been pretty much identical with larger, growthier companies, and these companies generally have better fundamentals and better earnings momentum and economies of scale that are continuing to outperform and push up large cap indices like the S&P 500. Whereas you're seeing kind of cracks underneath the surface as the economy slows and as the unemployment data soften in smaller areas, smaller cap areas of the market, smaller businesses. So this bifurcation that we've seen going on now for almost 2 years just keeps getting wider and wider, which is becoming a concern for investors and admittedly for us as we look ahead into the second half.
How do you invest around that, Michael? What does that tell you about allocating capital? Does it mean that perhaps the economic signs are not what we think? After all, Jay Powell this last week said that the jobs data may be overstated.
Yeah, there's a lot of mixed signals, and anyone who's good with data could build a case on either side of the bullish or bearish economic and market outlook because of this bifurcation and polarization we're seeing in the haves and the have-nots. This has been, again, a kind of a growing theme ever since the Fed started to get interest rates to these higher levels. And amidst the debate around if the economy is rate sensitive or has the Fed raised interest rates enough, I don't think we need to see the stock market or the economy to fall apart to say, oh, look, we're rate sensitive. These higher rates are hurting. We're clearly seeing it underneath the surface in the most rate sensitive parts of the market. And so that's been generally our view for almost 2 years. And our recommendation has stayed the same. Be overweight in areas of the market that companies have economies of scale, productivity, better free cash flow, and better profitability and better earnings growth. And we would argue we're in a very late cycle market earnings and macro environment, and that's typically where you see bifurcation and the strongest surviving the best. And we think that continues into the back half of the year.
So how do you want to allocate capital second half of the year, Michael? Here we are almost at the midpoint of the year.
Yeah, well, as the unemployment rate has started to tick up and get more people's attention, and that's going on while we're seeing other jobs related data soften as well. We're starting to see now a uptrend in initial unemployment claims. So for fixed income, I think that means you want to start moving in longer duration and somewhat moving out of cash. As the unemployment rate goes up, we think there's nothing more bullish for bond yields as we look into the second half and into the beginning of 2025. So interest rates, we think, are going to be heading lower. With regards to equity allocations, we would recommend investors stay in the market, but remain in, again, the higher quality, larger companies that can survive the longest as we see the unemployment rate continue to go up. We don't think the economy is falling off a cliff or there's an imminent risk to equities falling sharply, but you do definitely want to be avoiding areas of the market, again, like really cyclical areas that really depend on a broader economic environment of health and strength. We want to be avoiding those areas, and those would be kind of small caps, more value-oriented strategies, and other cyclical areas of the markets like transportation, autos, some financials, and industrials, whereas obviously tech stocks largely continue to do well, whether it's because these companies are mature and have growing stable businesses or they're tied into the AI story. But more broadly, again, I think just larger companies will continue to outperform in this environment.
All right, we will leave it there. Michael, always great to get your insights. Thanks so much.
Okay, take care. Thank you.
All right. Michael Kantrowitz joining us, Piper Sandler. Meanwhile, Silicon Valley no longer a sure thing for Democrats as President Trump is turning the tide. A major Democrat donor, a former Democrat donor, on why he's changed sides. Next. Welcome back. Deep blue turning red as the tide turns for Trump in Silicon Valley. Members of California's historically liberal technology community turning out to support the former president in a massive fundraiser last week. The Trump campaign raking in $12 million at the event. Jacob Hellberg was there. He serves as the senior policy advisor at Palantir and Stanford University Center on Geopolitics and Technology. Jacob, great to have you. Thank you so much for being here. You were once a prominent Democrat donor. You gave to Biden in his last presidential campaign, but you were there this week supporting President Trump. What happened?
So part of what we've seen over the last 4 years is I came from a one-party state, and like a lot of people in California and in Silicon Valley, I saw the Democratic Party get hijacked by the squad and a woke theology. President Biden campaigned as a moderate and ultimately has governed as a radical progressive. He has spent all of his time catering to his base, and ultimately he's now completely out of step with where the rest of the country is. Silicon Valley is in the business of building the future, and a lot of the philosophy that's been coming out of Washington has been about strangulating innovation instead of encouraging and supporting it.
Yeah, and we were talking earlier in the show about regulation with Senator Kramer that has really shackled so many executives in terms of their efforts to grow. Give us your sense of what specific policies are most problematic and where you want to see change in a new leadership in America.
Well, there are policies related to people's day-to-day work. The 44% capital gains would have an absolutely devastating impact on the venture capital business. The executive order on AI has caused a great deal of controversy because it has a mandatory reporting requirement that a lot of people view as a stepping stone to licensing. The crusade against crypto, a lot of people are very frustrated about that too. But there are also more personal issues, like October 7th. That has turned so many different voters into single-issue voters who were lifelong Democrats and who now see that the Democratic Party today is completely different than it was yesterday, and it's time to make a change.
Yeah, great point. Meanwhile, world leaders in Italy this weekend as the G7 continues. It was one of the major focuses at the G7 has been combating the threat of China and its support of Russia in the war against Ukraine. You also have Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen warning that China's over-concentrated supply chains pose a threat to U.S. jobs. Jacob, you're a member of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. What's your assessment of the China threat? And do you believe that business in America is starting to recognize the national security threat more so than the ability to sell to 1.4 billion people in China?
So here's what's important for every American to understand. We are in the grips of a technological arms race with China. AI is poised to, for the first time in a generation, give us a chance to reindustrialize in this country because it can radically reshape the efficiencies of our supply chains. But China is racing to weaponize this technology and dominate this market. We're now seeing companies in the U.S. and in China race to develop general-purpose humanoid robots. We cannot allow them to flood this market with subsidies and unfair competition. Ultimately, there's one candidate in this race who has proposed putting in place tariffs and protections against unfair trade, and that's President Trump. And it's so important that we recognize that because this is a make-or-break issue for the future of our country.
All right, Jacob Hellberg joining us. I've got one important thing you need to know about ahead of next week. That's next. Stay with us. Welcome back. One thing you need to know about ahead of next week, Americans are showing their dads a little extra love this Father's Day weekend. Spending expected to hit nearly $22.5 billion this year. That is the second highest number behind last year's record of $22.9 billion. 75% planning to celebrate, with the average person spending nearly $190 on gifts for dad. A number of restaurant chains also offering Father's Day deals and discounts, from fun and games at Dave & Buster's to a sweet treat at Baskin Robbins. Well, have a great Father's Day. I miss my dad so much. Here's me with my dad, and one thing I miss so much is cooking with him. He taught me how to cook, and I will always, forever be in debt. I know he must be cooking in heaven right now. I miss you, Dad, and I love you. Happy Father's Day. I will see you on Sunday over on the Fox News channel. Join me. I've got a big show live at 10 a.m. Eastern on Sunday Morning Futures, with interviews this weekend with Texas Senator Ted Cruz, former Housing and Urban Development Secretary Dr. Ben Carson, former Trump senior counselor Kellyanne Conway, and Florida Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna. I'll see you Sunday, 10 a.m. Eastern, live on Fox News. And that'll do it for us here on Fox Business. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope you have a wonderful Father's Day. Happy Father's Day to you, and I'll see you again next time.